people in the room. Okay, good evening. Thank you for joining us, both in the room and online. So I am here representing LMA tonight. We also have my colleague who's behind the computer. So if there are any questions that come up online, or if you have any comments about the feed or anything, please do pop them into the chat on YouTube. Here we'll be taking questions throughout, at the end as well. So as I say, thank you for joining us. We are very happy to once again have Kathleen Chater here, giving our talk on Black people at the Old Bailey this evening. So Kathleen, as I say, we're very glad to have her here. She completed her doctoral thesis in 2007, and as part of that created a huge database of individuals which included accounts from the Old Bailey. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from her. Okay, thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
We'll get it working, and it should be working now. So my apologies to the audience listening at home. The microphone should now be working. There we go. Do you mind if I? There we go.
Okay, thanks. Okay, those of you who couldn't hear me, you didn't miss much. What we'll now talk about is the criminal justice system generally. Okay, we start off. London, I have to say, is exceptional in various ways, but black people, again, are found at all levels, and individuals who wound up at the Old Bailey and in the higher courts might have gone through the lower levels first of all. The first one was the petty sessions, and this is JPs just meeting, sometimes in the church vestries, sometimes in their own homes or in a special office. And they heard and tried to sort out, very trivial matters. They would then refer the more serious cases upwards to the higher courts. Not many of the notices of the notes that they kept to do with the cases that they have survived, but there is quite an extensive one for Hackney. And you've got a copy of it here, I'm pretty certain. It's the Justice's Notebook for Hackney, covering the middle of the 18th century. There's one case involving a black man there. A woman came to the JP and said she'd had clothing stolen from her washing line, and somebody had told her it was a black man called George Scipio. So they summoned George Scipio, who they all knew. He brought some witnesses who gave him an alibi, an excuse. But even so, the JP was going to refer it to a higher court, but he didn't in the end. We don't know what happened. Like many, many cases, it just fizzled out. Perhaps the woman, realized it wasn't him. Perhaps, the JP thought the evidence wasn't strong enough. Whatever, it goes no further. So we know nothing about that. We know nothing about George Scipio either. The other place where you do find black people involved are the coroner's inquests. These into suspicious or unexplained deaths. There are some records of them in here in London Metropolitan Archives, but newspapers are actually the best source of information. Coroners could also refer cases to other courts, and in fact in some cases that we will see in the Old Bailey, they did refer a court, a supposed murderer, to the Old Bailey. The next thing, quarter sessions. These were held around the country 4 times a year. But in fact, in London, because there was so much crime in London, they were called sessions of the peace, and they were held 8 times a year. In the city, they were held in the Guildhall. Westminster held some, but the main ones were in Clerkenwell, where for the whole county of Middlesex, and for some cases Westminster, were held. The borough of Southwark, south of the river, held its own hearings, its own sessions of the peace, but their cases were then referred usually to the assizes in Surrey, because south of the river was the county of Surrey. So we don't know a great deal about what happened in Southwark, not without going to Woking, you don't. But anyway, so this is how in London they were sorted out. And then elsewhere in the country they have the assizes. This was the main court for trying serious cases. In London, they're held 6 times a year, and they're called sessions of Oyez and Termine and jail delivery. The aim was simply to empty the jails until you could start again. And they were held at the Old Bailey. There were separate hearings, separate courts for the city and for the county of Middlesex, which included Westminster. Also, and this again crops up occasionally involving black people, cases for the Admiralty, where crimes had been committed at sea, were also held in the Old Bailey. Now, the Admiralty cases, the records are in the National Archives, but the court records for the Old Bailey are held here in London Metropolitan Archives. And they're very, very useful because sometimes they give you supplementary information that you don't get from the actual, Old Bailey, the Old Bailey records. And then occasionally, cases might go to the Court of King's or Queen's Bench. This was to do with appeals or to determine points of law, like the Somerset case, where you decided on the nature of slavery in Britain, whether it was legal or not. And then ultimately, the House of Lords was the ultimate court in the country. Very few cases wind up there. I can't remember one involving any black people, but the majority of the cases in the London area are going to be held in the Old Bailey. Now, this is partly because if you could, at quarter sessions or the sessions of the peace, you could arrange for people to be transported. They could be sentenced to transportation. But if they were, the ratepayers had to pay the cost of sending them overseas. So, if, however, you referred it to the Old Bailey cases, then the government paid the fee, the costs of transportation. So, guess where most of the serious cases wind up? Exactly. Now, the problem with using the sort of records of these various courts, like the ones that are held in London Metropolitan Archive, is that colour is very, very rarely mentioned in the official documents. Only occasionally do you get it in statements from witnesses or people against whom a crime had been committed, like the business of someone telling Anne Godfrey at the, the Hackney JP sessions that it was a black man, George Scipio, who'd done it, So this only occasionally appears in the witness statements, which are called informations. There are some here in London Metropolitan Archives. The list of those called to give evidence, and that's all that often survives, does not mention colour or ethnicity. So how do we find out? This is the sessions of the Old Bailey from 1674 onwards were published. A shorthand writer took down what people said, it was printed up and sold to the public. This is the very, very first one that has survived from 1674. It's a bit patchy after. And first of all, it's called News from Newgate. It later became known as the Proceedings of the Old Bailey. Now, as you see, an exact and true account of the most remarkable trials of several notorious malefactors. Sensationalism in crime reporting is nothing new. It's been going on since then. So, as Marina said in the introduction, I included the cases in the Old Bailey in my database. I started my thesis in 2000, and what I was interested in, what I'm still interested in, is the average black person. Initially, I confined myself to the period of the slave trade, the long 18th century, and in 2000, the cases at the Old Bailey had not yet been digitised and put online. They were put online in 2005. So I read my way through them on microfilm. There are 10,000 cases between 1724, which was the earliest one that I could find on microfilm then, and 1812, when I stopped my thesis work. It took me about a year. I kept getting distracted by reading, of course, all the other interesting cases that didn't involve black people. But this is quite interesting. As I said, not colour is almost never given in official documents, and it's quite often not given in the proceedings of the Old Bailey, in the accounts of the trials. You have to find from newspapers, you have to cross-reference things, you have occasionally to guess. There's about 10 years when no indication of any kind is given. In fact, when I was compiling my database, I was surprised. There was just this huge gap, and I thought, oh, I've got to go back and do it again. I must have missed it somewhere. And I went back, and I did the 10 years again, but there is nothing there to indicate that there were black people, even though at this point I knew there were a huge number in London for various reasons from the other information I got from my database. There's also a guy called Scipio Africanus who appears in a document, in a trial. He's got to be black. That was a name that was given only to black men. There's a guy called Joseph Curry who was committed a crime and he fled. He was chased into a pub and he was trying to hide himself in the pub because there were about 40 black people in there already. Now, he wouldn't only have tried to hide himself if he was black too. There was no point in, trying to hide yourself in a pub full of white people if you were black. So that's the only indication that I have that Joseph Curry was black. And there's also a period in the early 19th century where you can only discover people's origins by newspaper reports. The other thing that's worth notice is that the polite term changed over the years. They were called all sorts of different things. Sometimes they were called Negro, they were blackamoor, they're the kind of words that people flinch at now. But they were the polite word at the time. And then in the 19th century, you start to get man or woman of colour and coloured. Also in the 19th century, Negro tends to be used for people who were from overseas. The indigenous people, the black people in London, were just called black. That was all anybody ever called them. There's also a word tawny, which people use. It's a sort of yellowish-brown colour, and you get tawny clothes, yellowish-brown colour. Sometimes it's somebody Arab, sometimes it's someone of mixed race, or sometimes it's somebody who I've no idea about. Oh, one of my favourite ones. In 1758, a guy called William Lyon was described by a witness as a barbarian. "He is a barbarian," said the witness. What is a barbarian?" the court asked. "He's a man from Barbados," said the witness, totally confidently. And I've no idea whether he was black or white, because of course there were white people from Barbados. And as I say, the definition of black, this is almost any dark-skinned person. Black, sometimes somebody described as black. I spent a lot of time following up people described as black and then finding, in fact, that as far as I could make out, they were British, they were, white. And also a Greek man is described as black. So this gives you a sort of indication. And the thing on tawny, here's another one that I rather like. This was a domestic violence case. and a woman stabbed the man she was living with. And a witness was, one of the neighbours, was cross-questioned. He was black, I believe. And the answer came, a tawny. He appeared a foreigner. And that's all we ever find out about him. He could be any nationality, any race. This didn't interest them. So this is the business that going through the trials like this, reading them, had a good effect for me because it made me see how other people were treated as well. I wasn't just cherry picking, going in and thinking, oh, this happened to a black person, therefore it must have happened to all of them. What I did realise going through these trials, you know, in the long, slow way, was that justice in the 18th century was absolutely savage. You know, people could be sentenced to death for stealing a handkerchief. But it was applied more or less equally. Also, coroners' inquests were held on black people just as carefully as those on white. And as I said, some of the deaths investigated wound up at the Old Bailey. I expected black people to be disproportionately punished, but no, they had the same sentences as everyone else. Now, as I say, the proceedings were digitised in 2005, so I was able to find a few earlier references. And then in 2011, newspapers began to be digitised by the British Newspaper Archive, and they're put online. Up till then, I was trekking out to Colindale regularly to go through newspapers to cross-check. And then I have later, since this, added cases up to the finish of this exhibition, 1860. However, there are more than 93,000 trials between 1812, where I finished originally, and 1860, and no, I didn't work my way through all of them for you. I just cherry-picked with the keywords, so I know I have missed a lot, because it's not a question of, you know, getting the clues all together. And after 1812, when I finished previously, there does seem to be the same level of equality. Black men were not picked out. There was a coloured man who was one of 4 men involved in a fight between neighbours in Finsbury. And a man died. He was hit by a brick by someone's wife. It's a very confused case. Picking your way through witnesses' evidence is always difficult. But he wasn't called to give evidence, and there was no attempt to blame him for the fight, you know, as you might expect. And in another case, a black man was part of a gang of 15 that raided a pawnbroker and silversmith shop. Basically, it was, you know, steaming. They all waded in, they smashed things, they grabbed things. He wasn't picked out in any way, and he wasn't especially punished. 2 men of the gang got a harsher sentence, and 4 were acquitted, but he was one of the middle lot who got the sort of medium sentence. There are lots of passing references to a black man or a black woman being present, you know. They were part of the everyday scenery. I must say, in all fairness, say that quite a few people caught with stolen goods said a black man had given it to them. So, you know, it may not be quite as equal as I think. So, let's look now at the process and how black people appear in trials. This is the Old Bailey, the Sessions House, where they wound up. At the bottom here, you will see that little gateway. Those were the prison, those were the cells where prisoners were held, and they came up into the courtroom. And then at the end of the trial, if they were to be punished further, you got the expression, take him down. And that's where it comes from, sending them down to the cells below the Old Bailey. This is the courtroom. Now, as you see, it's amazingly crowded. It's amazingly crowded because it was open to the public. This was an unusual thing, especially in parts of Europe at this time. The point about justice was it was not only done, it had to be seen to be done, and this is how it could be reported and how shorthand writers could take down what was said and then publish it to their own profit. There was nothing stopping. There were a couple of attempts occasionally to clear newspaper reporters out, but it didn't work. They weren't having any. So this is the interesting thing about it, that it was reported. Oops, sorry. Oh, damn. How do I get back? Sorry. I pressed the wrong button.
There we go.
Thanks. Okay, so that's the courtroom. And as you see, at the far end, behind all the pillars, that's a lot of the public, you know, and there's all the sort of, you know, court officials, witnesses, and all the rest. So that's how, you know, it looked to the people involved. So let's now have a look at the roles that people played. They were defendants. There are more black defendants than prosecutors. It was in the 18th century and well into the 19th century, it was up to the person who had the crime committed against them to bring the case. And it could cost them money, you know, they had to take time off work. So, you know, there was a sort of balance about how far you were going to go with this. But there are mainly defendants. There are more black defendants than prosecutors. This is partly because prosecutors a lot of them were shopkeepers who'd had stuff stolen from them, or they were householders who'd been burgled. And I think this is an indication that the black people in London at that time were part of the poorer section of the community. They were poorer, so they didn't have, you know, houses to be robbed. There are people who had houses. There was a black man who was allowing his house to be used for an illegal lottery, you know. That was nearby, quite near here actually. But I'm just saying that in general, there are more black people accused of crime than having crime against them. Witnesses. Now, this is an interesting thing because in the colonies and in America, black people were not allowed to testify against white. They weren't allowed to bring cases against them and they weren't allowed to testify. But here, no problem at all. They both accused white people of crimes and they gave evidence. And like I said, they're sometimes just mentioned in passing. They were just there at the time. Now also, so we've looked at the roles that they played. Let's have a look at the crimes that were committed by black people. Theft is the most common one, including highway robbery. Then assault, sometimes in the course of a robbery. And as it happens, these are the most common crimes that everybody committed. And in fact still do. I worked in the probation service for a bit, and yep, it's theft and assault, which is still the most common one. And then we've got perjury and personation. I must tell you one thing about the theft thing. As I say, it's the most common thing. The first black person I found appearing at the court at the Old Bailey was in 1695. There was a guy called James Grantham, and he was accused of stealing a trunk from the back of a coach because you strapped your luggage to the back of the coach. And the traffic here in London was as slow as it is now, you know. And so people would nip out, slash the straps, and steal the trunk. Now, James Grantham had been seen with this trunk, and his defence was, I picked it up in the street. It fell off the back of a coach, he said. And he was acquitted, which is quite interesting. They believed him. Yep, he was acquitted. Anyway, personation and perjury. Soldiers and sailors were paid off at the end of a voyage or a period overseas. And that might be quite a lot of money, especially for sailors, because they got prize money. If they captured enemy ships, they shared in the loot. And that may be quite a lot. And occasionally people tried to claim money due to someone else. And there are some black people who are included in this particular case. There's a guy called Joseph Scott. He was a black, I think he was a sailor, Anyway, he tried to claim the money due to someone else, but he was having trouble because the someone else was white, and also this Joseph Scott had lost both his feet. He obviously had some appalling accident, you know, but anyway, it didn't work, and he was sentenced to be transported. But so were other white men who tried the same trick at the same sessions. So they were all transported. It wasn't that he was picked out. Now, sometimes this is sort of shades into perjury, swearing a false oath, depending what people had actually done. And my favourite case here, a guy called Joseph Alexander. He was the servant of a French duke, and a stonemason in Islington, I think, hired him to give his daughter French lessons to increase her chances of an upwardly mobile marriage, to complete her, as he said. Anyway, things didn't fall out quite like that. Joseph and the girl, Charlotte, fell in love, and they eloped. And he swore a false oath. So he said that she was over 21, so she didn't need her father's permission to marry, but she was only 16. And Dad was incandescent, not because Joseph was black, but because he was only a servant, and he spent all this money trying to increase his daughter's chances, and anyway, he wanted to choose her husband. So he brought the case. So the judge respited sentence. He said, I'll sentence him later. I think he was trying to persuade Dad to say, look, come on, he's the servant of a duke, you know, she's going to have a good life. But the really, really sad thing is, and when I read it, I saw it in the newspaper, he died in prison while he was waiting to hear about the sentence. Prisons were awful places. In fact, I read it in the newspaper and I went, oh no, you know, and everybody sort of turned around. I couldn't believe it. I was so sad. Anyway, as I say, rapes, there's only one case where a black man was accused of rape, which people find extraordinary, but there's only one case. A black man, he was accused of rape, John Sutton, but the woman who accused him was mixed race, and she was an ex-girlfriend. He'd since got married, and he said, she's still pursuing me. It's a very, very murky case. I think he did rape her, but he got away with it because that was always the excuse. You know, they always said, you know, yeah, she's an ex-girlfriend, she's after me. And there was another case, a guy called William Smith. He had been a servant and another servant in the same house. Then he left to set up a fast food stall in Hyde Park. And the woman, she went on pursuing him, and she claimed he'd stolen a ring from her. And then, although she didn't claim rape in her accusation, she did say in the course of giving her evidence that he'd raped her when he stole the ring. And he said, I didn't need to rape her. I've laid with her 20, 30 times. She's an ex-girlfriend. And what happened? He got off. So that's the only sort of cases. And that was also what happened to white men too. That was always their excuse. I mean, it still is in a way. Yeah, it was consensual, you know. So then we've got riot and riot. I'll talk about murders and manslaughter later. Riot and riotous assembly and treason. The Gordon riots were part of the riotous assembly thing. Let's have a look. Here we are, the Gordon riots in 1780. As you can see, there are some black, well, I don't know if you can see it very well on that picture, but there are some black people involved in the crowd. And many, many people were tried for their involvement in this. These were anti-Catholic riots fomented by a man called Lord Gordon. And 4 black people are known to have been involved in these riots. 3 of them appeared at the Old Bailey. The 3 who appeared at the Old Bailey were tried and sentenced to death, just like everybody else who was involved. But the 2 men, Benjamin Bosey and John Clubber, were reprieved and transported because previous employers, people who they weren't working for anymore, petitioned the Lord Mayor of London to have them free. They said they were just silly people. They were just, misled. And so they weren't executed. They were transported. But the third one, Charlotte Gardner, she couldn't call anybody to speak for her, and she was executed. And then the fourth person who we know to have been involved in that was a career criminal called Joseph Mountain. He had been involved in a lot of robberies in England, highway robberies. He was involved in highway robbery in France, but he got away with it all. And he had also been involved with the Gordon riots. And he said he wasn't there because he was anti-Catholic. He was there to loot houses, which he did. Anyway, finally, he went back to America because things were getting a bit hot in Britain for him. He went back to America where he raped a woman, and he was hanged for it. He was hanged in America. But his confession was, told the whole story of his life in some detail. The other one, the treason. Oops. Treason. Here's the a bit more of the Gordon riots. And as you can see down here, there is someone black in the crowd, So that's the Gordon riots. Now, the Cato Street conspiracy, I went up to 1820 with this. This was a plan to overthrow the government in 1820 by killing the Prime Minister and various ministers, government ministers. And this is, you can do a Cato Street walk. I do suggest that you do. It's really interesting. There's a lot of books on it. It's a really, really complicated case. But one of the men involved in it was William Davidson. He was the illegitimate son of the Attorney General of Jamaica and a black woman. The Attorney General actually did his best for William. He sent him to England to be apprenticed to a lawyer because there's no way that he'd have got a decent job in Jamaica. But the boy didn't like it, and he ran away to sea. He was press-ganged into the Royal Navy. Then he was discharged and went to Scotland because his father had arranged for him to study mathematics in Aberdeen. But he didn't like that either. So he came to Birmingham and became a cabinet maker. His business failed, so he moved to London. And then this was where he got involved in politics and in the Cato Street conspiracy to overthrow the government. What is interesting about the Cato Street conspiracy is that all the men involved in it had failed in some way, like Davidson, that they were angry with the government because they felt that was, it was their fault that they'd all failed. Thistlewood, the leader of it, was a nutter. I mean, I'm not qualified on this, but I do think that he was insane. Anyway, they were all hanged, and there's the sort of engraving of their hanging outside Newgate. Like I say, there's various books on the conspiracy, and it's worth reading up. Okay, so I went up originally roughly to about 1820 on my doctoral thesis. And after about 1820, which is the last really interesting case, they mainly go back, and I'm sorry to say this, to be really, really dull cases. They're just, basically poor people, some black people stealing from white, some white people stealing from black. And they're quite ordinary, they're everyday, and there are assaults. And some of the assaults led to deaths, which we'll talk about a bit later. There's a case outside that is worth having a look at. John Shropshire and Thomas Windsor. Those two, that's a rare case because it's a black man stealing from another black man. And go out and sort of read the thing about him, because one of them appears to have been the servant of Sir Joshua Reynolds, the painter. And so read about him there. But I'm just saying that that's a rare case, because usually, crime being an equal opportunities employer, white stole from black and black stole from white. It wasn't a big deal. Now, like I say, most of the cases were really dull, except in 1850, there is a really interesting case I think it's unique. I haven't come across another case like this, and it has a contemporary sort of interest. In 1850, a 20-year-old black man who was a cross-dresser, his name was Elijah Scott, but he calls himself Eliza Scott. He picked up a man who assumed he was a prostitute and was quite happy to become a client until she lifted the veil. And then he realized what he got himself into. He was really angry, this guy. Most people would have just snuck away, you know, but no, he brought a case. And Scott was brought to the Old Bailey and he was charged with assault with sodomitical intent, which is, you know, quite severe. I'm not sure about this. I think it may have carried the death penalty at this point. I'd need to check the law thoroughly. But either way, that was a really, really serious charge to bring. And there's no question that he was the person concerned. The proceedings give us only a very, very brief outline, and they don't mention sodomy, and they don't mention that the Scott person was black. They simply give it a little summary because, of course, it was sold to the public, and so not for the eyes of women and children. Luckily, the Era, which was the trade magazine for the entertainment industry, covered it in enormous detail. They probably, I mean, he was probably part of the sort of, you know, there was a, it appears in the cases discussed in a book about the the homosexual underworld in London. But anyway, it was covered in the Era in full. Now, the interesting thing is that the charge against him, sodomitical assault, was reduced to common assault, which is the same you get for smacking somebody. You know, it's just an ordinary assault. Now, that's quite interesting that they reduced the charge from something serious to something, you know, relatively trivial. And he was sentenced to a year in prison. I tried to follow up what happened to him. Which prison did he go to? But he doesn't. He doesn't appear in any prison records or any surviving prison records. I don't think he died in prison like Joseph Alexander. I haven't found any mention of this. I think they may have worried, do we send him to a woman's prison or a male prison? And they just thought, just go away, you know. But he just, whatever it is, he just disappears at that point. So now we've looked at the crimes that black people committed. Let's look at the crimes that were committed against them. These are most commonly also theft and assault. Now, Lascars were sailors from Asia. They were seamen from the Indian subcontinent employed by the East India Company. And then, you know, as Chinese seamen became more common, they were more widely employed from the 19th century. The East India Company had some lodging houses for them, and they also had interpreters who came to court to interpret for them. And very often they accuse you know, the lodging house keepers of stealing from them. Now, one of these men, he wasn't actually a Lascar. His story is outside. His name is John Morgan. He set a precedent. In 1764, this servant, John Morgan, brought a case against the owners of the lodging house where he was staying, saying that they'd stolen some of his possessions. And he asked to swear on the Quran because he was a Muslim. And the judges said, nobody's done that before. Let's have a think about it. So they adjourned the case for, I think it was about a month, while they took legal opinion and they went off and saw, can they do it? And then they came back and said, okay, yep, do it. And this is the first time that I have found in an English court that someone swore on the Quran, and that had set a precedent. You find it regularly after that. If you want to find people swearing on the Quran, it's actually spelled Al-Quran, A-L-K-O-R-A-N, and that's how you find the ones who've sworn on the Quran. Most of them appear to be from their names Arab, but there are some from the Indian subcontinent, and I suspect there are some Africans among them. So it's quite interesting to see that there he is, John Morgan, who set the precedent. Now, the family he accused, the father and mother, were found guilty and they were sentenced to transportation. They were transported. Their son was acquitted. And as I say, after that, no problem at all. They pitch up, they swear on the Quran. Now, very, very few women appear at the Old Bailey, and pretty well all of them were accused of theft. And this is a typical scenario. Two women are about to get this seaman, and he might be black or he might be white. They're going to get him drunk and they're going to rob him. You see the ship behind that he has just been paid off on. He is rich and they are going to rob him. They also preyed on servants who were out on an errand, who were carrying money to buy something. Anne Duck in the exhibition here, she preyed on men like this. She always worked with somebody white as well. You know, they were, as I say, crime was an equal opportunity employer. She is the person who made the most appearances before the Old Bailey. That's her record. The black person who made the most appearances. She kept getting let off. She was let off again and again and again. But then finally, she went too far and she was hanged. Also, it's worth noting that men of different ethnicities worked together. So, I've mentioned a couple of the sentences. What were the others? The thing is that crimes were divided into misdemeanors, which were fairly minor, and felonies, which were serious. And the level of felony changed over the years, you know, over the century. Originally, theft of something worth more than a shilling was a felony. Later, it became 40 shillings. You know, inflation hits us all sooner or later. And so the sentences initially were flogging or putting people in the pillory or branding. They were maiming people in some way, marking them so that future employers would know that they had been, you know, convicted of a crime. They could be fined. They could be sent to a house of correction for very short sentences, maybe a year. I think that's the most I've seen. And then transportation was really common for 7 years, for 10 years, for 14 years, or for life. And even if you were only sentenced to 7 years, you had to pay your own fare back. So most people who were sentenced to transportation, occasionally people managed to get themselves back, you know, by some means. And you do find cases in the Old Bailey of people returning from transportation before the time was up. And execution, again, quite common. Execution was very often commuted to transportation if it was thought that the person could be reformed by taking them away from their criminal environment. So this required, you know, sort of a reference from somebody else, like the two black men who were involved in the Gordon riots. They got references from their previous employers, so their sentence of execution was commuted to transportation. Now, this is fairly well attested. Of all those sentenced to be executed, everybody, black, white, or whatever, only about a third of them were actually executed. About 2/3, they had their sentence commuted to transportation or some other thing. And interestingly, on the survey that I did of black people sentenced to death, the same number, exactly the same number of people, a third, were executed and 2/3 were let off or the sentence commuted. Transportation did not end until 1867, after the period this exhibition covers. Over the 19th century, the laws changed, becoming less harsh. Also, for various reasons, insanity became a matter of great public interest and concern. From the early 19th century onwards, insanity became, you know, a more regular defence, and insane asylums, hospitals were set up. This is Edward Oxford. He was the first person to make an attempt on Queen Victoria's life, the young Queen, in 1840, by shooting at her in her carriage when she was out driving. And he made a really important contribution to judicial history. What no one seems to have noticed writing about him, that he seems to have had some kind of black ancestry. It seems that his father was a man of colour, and he died of an overdose of laudanum, and the boy was then about 7. The doctor who treated his father in his last, in his death, was called to give evidence at Oxford's trial, and it was suggested that the father had committed suicide and the boy had inherited insanity from him. This was a common theory at the time. And interestingly, nothing was made of the fact that his father was a man of colour, that he was black. No one said that's why he was insane. They simply said that, he inherited insanity from his father. Alas, there are no inquest records for him in London Metropolitan Archives. They haven't survived. And no newspaper reports. It wasn't an interesting enough death to be reported in the newspapers. Anyway, Edward Oxford was found not guilty, being insane. Queen Victoria, however, really objected to this verdict. She thought this would be a get-out for far too many people. So in future, the verdict became guilty but insane, which is an interesting distinction. He was guilty of the crime, but he was insane. Not that he was not guilty. Anyway, he was sent to a criminal asylum. He was later released and went to Australia, where he made literally an entirely new name for himself. He called himself John Freeman. He became a journalist and an author, and he died in Melbourne when he was 78. But he made an interesting contribution to history. So, Edward Oxford didn't kill the Queen. There is only one black murderer that I have found who was convicted in the whole period of this exhibition, and this is a guy called John Hogan. In 1875, it's not entirely clear where he comes from. He's just described as black. He may be Indian, but we don't actually know. He burgled a house in Charlotte Street, and he didn't realise that there was a servant in there. He cut her throat. She died a few days later. And her employer, who was a lawyer, worked really, really hard to find out who'd done it. Hogan was brought before magistrates, the petty sessions, to be referred to a later court, 2 or maybe 3 times, but let off each time because there wasn't enough evidence. Finally, the lawyer managed to get enough evidence to prove the case him, and he was hanged. So he is, as I say, the only person I have found who was a murderer in this time. There were manslaughter cases. Saka, Gloss and Saval were Malaysian, and they beat to death another Malayan called Imam Bacchus. It's never entirely clear why they did it. They couldn't find a sort of an interpreter good enough to sort of get the cases, but they were, because it was manslaughter, they were sentenced to 1 year in prison and a 1 shilling fine. And now, domestic violence is nothing new. John Benjamin Facey, tried in 1843, was nicknamed Black Jack, and he assaulted the woman he lived with. It looks like this caused a miscarriage, and she died. He was found guilty of manslaughter and transported for 10 years. Now, those are the only people. And again, the woman I mentioned earlier who was living, her name's Catherine Bainbridge, who was living with a man who was a tawny, whatever that might mean. She also was convicted of manslaughter. Now, these are the black people who were killed by white people. Henry Oliver, was killed by John Burnham. They were both having a really, really bad day when they met each other. They'd had some really unpleasant experiences. Burnham's wife was being arrested, and Oliver, not realising the relationship, just turned to John Burnham and said, "She's a whore, she deserves to be hanged." And Burnham took this very badly and stabbed him. Anyway, Burnham stabbed him twice and Burnham was hanged. John Dulham, this is quite an interesting case. He seems to have been a Lascar, a sailor from Asia somewhere. He was put out in the street by a lodging house keeper called Jacob Jeggett when he was ill, and he died. The judge found that this wasn't actually illegal to put someone who was ill out into the street, but he kept him into prison until to find out whether there was anything else he could be charged with. Well, there was actually. He was charged with assault at the sessions of the peace, and he was imprisoned and fined. Sylvia Woodcock is an interesting case. She came from India, but she's described as a mulatto. She may have been, we think she was probably of African origin, because of the Arab slave trade with India, the Arab slave trade from East Africa to India. There are a number of people there who are descended from Africans, and they're known as Siddhis or Habshis. They are still a separate sort of community within India. We think this was her. She came as a servant with a family from India. She married a man called William Woodcock in Cheshire. He got a job in London. He wanted to marry somebody else, and so he lured her to London, telling her he had a job for her. He beat her up and left her dying. He thought she was dead in Chelsea, in a ditch in Chelsea. The parish authorities brought in a doctor and a chemist to treat her. They also brought in a justice of the peace to take down her dying statement that, it was her husband who'd done this. And the parish authorities in Chelsea also offered a really, really huge reward for turning Woodcock in, which they did. And he was tried and he was hanged, no problems. A few years later, in a very similar case, the defendant's counsel said that a dying statement should not be used because it couldn't be cross-referenced. But the court said, well, we've done it before. It wasn't actually a precedent because it turns out that there was a very obscure Tudor law that allowed for it when they investigated. But the point was that they were willing to say, yeah, we've done this for Sylvia Woodcock, so we'll do it for this guy too. So quite interesting that she was, involved in another case, and it was her dying, statement. Joseph Walker was a domestic case. Anne Thompson, the woman he lived with, he came back home drunk. He tried to get in, and he had a history of domestic violence. He'd beaten her up before. She stabbed him. She was only given 3 months imprisonment and fined £1. Sarah Williamson, a domestic, she was killed by her husband, Robert Williamson. He was a Chelsea pensioner. Both of them were drunk. They had a history of getting drunk together and arguing. They quarrelled. He was found guilty of assault only, although she died. And on account of his age, he was 68, he was just sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment. So they obviously modified that because of his age. And then finally, Joseph Frost, in 1849, a guy called Henry Stockman was charged with killing and slaying him. This appears to have been a coroner's inquest. And what you do notice about coroner's inquests is they always up the charge because it's easier to reduce a charge, to say, no, it wasn't murder, it was manslaughter. But if you're trying somebody for manslaughter, and then you think, hang about, this was really murder. Legally, it's extremely difficult to up it. So the coroner's courts say, yeah, he killed him. And then it was, tried out. It turns out that Joseph Frost, he was a seaman from Barbados. He'd fallen out of a boat while he was drunk. And Henry Stockman had tried to pull him back in with a hook on a rope, but had somehow managed to get the boy under the water, and he drowned. He was strongly recommended to mercy, and he was only fined 1 shilling. So they obviously accepted he was doing his best. So now let's very quickly move on to the witnesses. This is the trial of John Sutherland. Like I said, in America and the Caribbean, black people couldn't testify against white. Not a problem here. This is Captain John Sutherland, who murdered the cabin boy who was white at sea. And the only evidence against him was the steward, John Thompson, who was black. He's the only witness. So Sutherland was hanged on his evidence. So there's one more very quick case that I want to talk about, a witness. I haven't got any pictures. In 1746, a witness called Catherine Burke tried to steal candles from a shopkeeper in Goswell Road. The shopkeeper summoned the parish constable to arrest her, and he gave evidence at the Old Bailey. The shorthand writer did not catch his name, so he left a blank and wrote Negro Constable. So I looked up the list of the witnesses who appeared at the case in the records in here in London Metropolitan Archives, and I found out his name is Thomas Latham. So he's the first black constable to appear in British records. It wasn't a big deal, there he is. And I also looked through the parish vestry minutes to see when he was appointed, to see if anybody had made anything about appointing a black parish constable. It's not mentioned. There's no mention of it in the vestry minutes. And in case you're wondering about him, later he seems to have got married in Southwark and raised a family there. He just disappears. Now, I'm just now going to show you a load of pictures, because what I want to emphasise, what comes out of the cases in the Old Bailey, and I've only given you a sort of brief summary of the more entertaining ones, what comes out of it is how much a part of everyday life black people were in London. Here is a picture called May Morning. In many ways, the evidence that they give is more interesting than whether they were accused of a crime or they were accusing other people, or what they were sentenced to, because broadly they weren't different. So when you see something like this, it's one of the things that you can play when you see a crowd scene in London. There's nearly always a black person somewhere in the crowd scenes. There's an account, although there is an account in 1764 of a ball of blacks being held in Fleet Street, to which no white people were allowed to go in. And a guy called Jack Beef, who was the black servant of a magistrate from the West Indies, he went to a ball of blacks later. And as we've seen, Joseph Curry tried to disappear into a pub with a black clientele. So we know there were places where black people gathered. But in general, as we see from the evidence here and we see from the pictures, they mingled with everybody else. We tend always to think first of black servants. Quite a few gave evidence. One, often with their masters, they were travelling with their masters when they were held up by highwaymen. But all these servants also had a social life. They were quite often out for a drink with their mates, or they were going somewhere when something kicked off. Here is a pub scene, and we see the black guy obviously recounting a boxing match. But what we do find, one of the cases that I found, a chap called Robert Wadeson was having a drink with some mates in a pub when 4 Irishmen started fighting. They seem to have been, just mucking around originally. And the landlord asked them to leave, to stop making a disturbance, and they attacked the landlord. Wadeson went to his assistance. even though he was just a servant out thing, but he went to his assistants. He was called to give evidence. He seems to have been, because his evidence was taken down in shorthand, he was very, very well spoken. He was a servant. He'd been in England for 28 years. Anyway, in the course of the sort of, play fighting, and then what developed into a really serious argument and fight, one man died, but Wadeson was only called to give evidence because he was just sort of sitting there when something happened. We see them socialising in other places. This is a picture called the Westminster Pit, and as you can see, there are several black men in the crowd, and it also appears to be an illegal event because somebody is keeping a lookout on the far right at the door. The other thing as well, the upper classes had clubs for white men only, but the lower classes have what were called cock and hen clubs. These were social events where both men and women belonged to the club. What does emerge from the cases that we have seen is the number of mixed marriages. There were a lot. They come up as sort of domestic violence cases, but quite often they come up as, sort of mentions. The educated classes may have believed, especially in the 19th century, that black people were inferior, scientific racism, but the lower classes didn't have any problem with this. There's a guy called John Micaiah Collins who was indicted for bigamy. He was first married to Elizabeth Mason, who unfortunately wasn't called to give evidence. And he claimed to his second wife that his first wife, who was black, had died. He told her father the first wife had left him and he was divorced. He was transported for 7 years. No further information. And here, these were a load of people waiting to see a doctor in Whitechapel. And it's just a reminder of both multiculturalism and how all the people in this picture who were from different kind of ethnic groups, they would all have been called black. And some of the white people might have been called black too. So it is a problem when you're going through them. And I don't want to end on an unhappy note, a lot of people waiting to see a doctor. So let's see a party. And like I say, this is something that does come out, the business of socializing among, ordinary people when you look at the works, the proceedings, the trials. Now, if you want to find out more about the trials, Old Bailey Online has trials between 1674 and 1913. You can go through it by date, you can go through it by crime. If you run the sort of, keywords, black, a coloured man, a black man, you can sort of turn them up, but I am pretty certain I haven't got them all, Now, digital panopticon, the digital panopticon, this traces the lives of 90,000 convicts sentenced at the Old Bailey between 1780 and 1875, and it links the Old Bailey trials to the relevant records in various databases of criminal justice, civil records, including the censuses. There's all sorts of things about them there. It is a bit patchy. Like I say, I couldn't find Elijah or Eliza Scott there. But they do see, there's quite a lot of information about them. And in some cases, you've got their histories, their life histories that have been added to this. You can either go on Bailey Online, and then you can see that there is a link from one trial to the person on this one. And then there's the digital panopticon. And the other one that is quite interesting is London Lives, Crime, Poverty and Social Policy in the Metropolis. This is a huge number of records. It's got quite a lot of the records from London Metropolitan Archives on it as well. It's done by the same team that did the Old Bailey Online, and so it's got sort of links to the trials, but it has a lot of digitised copies of documents that you find here. It's got inquest records, for example. And then finally, the British Newspaper Archive is, I mean, literally they are adding newspapers weekly to it. But again, the business of finding people on there is a business of looking at the sort of keywords and things like that. But if you can find a trial in the Old Bailey online, it is always worth following it up in the newspapers, because the Old Bailey may concentrate on the evidence to prove a crime, but the newspapers go in for the human interest in a big, big way. So you get a lot of other information there too. So I hope I've given you an idea about the kind of information you can get, and something about the lives of black people in Britain as revealed in the trials. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, just one. I keep forgetting to do this. Let me plug my own book. Untold Histories. That's my doctoral thesis that was published. There is no book list for this because there is no book about black criminals. They are treated no differently from white throughout the entire country. So I've got a section in here about, analysing all the information I found in the Old Bailey and mentions of other trials elsewhere around the country. There's a copy of the book here, or you can buy this. It's extremely cheap in paperback. Okay, fine. Plug over. That's the advertisement done.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm sure everyone found that really interesting. And interestingly, anyone has done research here at LMA, you have access to the British Newspaper Archive in our information.
Oh, yeah, I've forgotten that. Yeah, sorry.
Does anyone have any questions at all? We'll take questions from the room first, I think, and then we'll go online. And rather awkwardly,
I think I wondered where debtors' prisons fitted in.
Sorry?
Debtors' prisons, or is that more Charles Dickens?
That's civil. That's a civil case, you see. Yes, yeah. I'm just doing the criminal. No, it's debtors is a civil case.
Because if most of the crimes were theft and assault related to robbery and theft, because they were poor, where did debtors' prisons fit in?
Debtors tend to be people with businesses. The business fails, and therefore you can't pay, or you can't pay your creditors. You can't pay for things like that. So there was a whole complicated process of getting somebody their business going bust, liquidation and such like. But I haven't actually looked at this in great detail. But as I say, it's a civil case, and I can't remember whether I've seen anything about black people in there, but they may well have been there if their business has failed, yeah.
Apologies for being late, but what was interesting is because black people are described in so many different ways, and a lot of people who weren't actually black would even be described as black. That must have made your sort of research quite difficult. I mean, I'm of mixed heritage. My dad's Nigerian, I was half Norwegian and Swiss. And over the years, people have thought I was Turkish, Sicilian, Indian, Ethiopian. So that's just really interesting. So in that period, it must have been even harder. So there must have been a lot of people that weren't black that were categorised as black, and a lot of people that were black that potentially just wasn't even mentioned.
Yeah.
Even harder. And just one quick thing as well. You mentioned that there was the first reference to a black constable.
Parish constable, yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they weren't black constables before, just weren't mentioned. They could have been black people in the constabulary previously, but just they weren't mentioned because it wasn't seen as a big deal. And it's just interesting to me when it actually did become a big deal being black, because today it's a big deal being black, and historically in terms of crime and how black people have been criminalised and all the deaths of black people in custody, it suddenly became, definitely from the 40s onwards, it became black people were treated very differently from the police. I don't know when you think it might have changed.
Well, there is a school of thought on this that thinks it was the American influence, you see, that America became so, so popular, so their cultural influences and all the rest. There's a book coming out, I'm going to buy it, This Is Not America, A guy called oh God, I can't remember his name. Anyway, it's called This Is Not America. There was an article in the Times this week about it. You know, he'd written an article about it, pointing out how very, very different America and Britain is. Although we keep adopting, you know, American sort of things. And again, there is, as I say, a school of thought. When I was at the BBC, I did some research on this. We were looking at black servicemen from America in Britain, you know, during World War II. Yeah, and there is a school of thought, as I say, that thinks that we started to take on America's, you know, classifications and things. And there were other things in the 40s, you know, and post-war, but it does seem to be that we've, you know, American attitudes have been much stronger since World War II.
Just adding to that point about the confusion with colour, I was interested in the word tawny, because and I know that, for example, in the 17th and 18th century there were Asians coming into London, brought in by East India Company and so on, and you mentioned about Lascars.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering how much confusion there was about the difference between, for example, Afro-Caribbean people and Asian people. I'm sure there was a lot of confusion about that.
I'm not sure, but all I'm saying is that...
I think, you know, when it's written down.
The other thing is that, like I say, well, like the woman who said, he's a tawny, some kind of foreigner, you know. I mean, this is London. That London has always been a multicultural city. And so I think it was simply that, also you didn't have that kind of classification. You know, sort of scientific racism started in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. And that was when they started to sort of decide between people to say that this is a Caucasian, this is this person, this is another person. Up till then, you were just a foreigner, basically.
You mentioned also about the Court of Admiralty as well.
Sorry?
The Court of Admiralty.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And, trials regarding, for example, piracy. What about theft from ships on the Thames? Is that also the Admiralty Court?
No, that's in, it was, the Admiralty, somebody said that the Admiralty dealt with murder and mayhem on the high seas. They didn't really bother about minor pilfering and things like that. And so again, if your ships were robbed in the docks, then it was a local court that sorted that out.
And have you come across any of those?
Sorry?
Did you come across any of those?
Oh yeah, there's loads. of pilfering, you know. Yeah. I'm sorry, I know it sounds terrible, but I mean, it's just another dull theft, you know.
Any other questions in the room? No? Okay. Tom,
As of yet, we have no questions online.
Okay. Well, give it a few more minutes online.
I can have a
Yeah.
ask a quick question in the meantime.
One of the charges was someone accused of killing and slaying.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the two, or is it sort of hyperbole when it comes to...
That's just, I think that's just, you know, hyperbole. Yeah, yeah.
Any final questions? We've got no final questions for people at home, so we can draw the Q&A to them.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kathleen. If
Pleasure.
anyone does have any final questions, please do ask them. We have the building and exhibition is just before 7 o'clock. We are up at 7. If anyone wants to come and we're it's free to get to the as well, so you can come back. They're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.